Prince William walked straight down that ceremonial line, past 20 guards in perfect formation. Then he stopped, right in front of Sergeant Rowan Hale. "You broke bearing," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. What happened next wasn't just a dressing down. It was public humiliation that stripped a 20-year veteran of his post, in front of hundreds of witnesses. But here's what the palace never expected. That same guard they thought they'd silenced. He was about to teach them the difference between respect and fear, and by the time he was finished speaking, the shame didn't belong to him anymore. Now, before we show you exactly how one man's dignity brought down a prince's authority, make sure you're subscribed to our channel Guard Watch and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to see will change how you think about duty forever. February mornings at Buckingham Palace bite straight through your coat and settle in your bones. The kind of cold that makes tourists huddle together behind rope barriers, breath puffing white above their scarves as they crane necks for something worth posting about. For Sergeant Rowan Hale, standing motionless on the forecourt in his scarlet tunic, the cold was just another detail to ignore. At 43, his body had learned stillness the hard way, not from parade ground, but from places where moving at the wrong moment could get you killed. The bearskin added a foot to his already impressive height, but it was his eyes that marked him as different, deeper than the younger guards around him, like someone who'd seen things that ceremony couldn't touch. Those ribbons on his chest weren't for marching in straight lines. They told stories of Sierra Leone riots, where he'd held civilians behind him with nothing but his presence, of Helmand valleys, where he'd stood positioned through mortar strikes until every person in his sector was clear. But today, his world was measured in heartbeats and stillness. Today, his only job was to stand perfectly still while Prince William himself conducted the formal inspection. The crowd sensed something special was happening. When the heir to the throne shows up personally to review his soldiers, every breath matters. The gates swung open with that heavy, deliberate sound that 3 centuries of ceremony have perfected. William entered with Queen Camilla beside him, each step carrying authority that didn't need to announce itself. His dark uniform was immaculate, but it was his expression that caught attention, sharp, focused, like a man looking for something specific. The inspection began with clockwork precision. William moved slowly down the line, pausing here and there to exchange quiet words with his aide. Each guard stood like carved stone, backs straight, rifles steady, eyes fixed on that invisible point beyond the crowd. Most of these guards were too young to remember when Diana was alive, but Rowan was different. He'd been part of her discreet security detail during those final months, watching for threats from unexpected directions. He remembered her gripping his arm that last night, fingernails digging through his uniform sleeve. "Promise me something," she'd whispered. "If they succeed in silencing me, don't let them rewrite who I was." He'd promised, a promise kept locked away for 27 years. The inspection line moved with that same quiet gravity it always did. William took his time, noting a polish here, a posture there. The tourists pressed closer to the rope barriers, children climbing on their parents' shoulders for a better view. That's when it happened. "Guard!" A boy's voice rang out, sharp with excitement. The kid couldn't have been more than 7, standing on tiptoes behind the barrier, pointing at the towering figures in their bearskin hats. His mother tried to shush him, but the damage was done. That pure, uninhibited joy that only children can project had cut through centuries of protocol like a knife through silk. It was instinct more than thought. Rowan's eyes flicked toward the sound, not a full turn, not even a break in stance, just the faintest shift, the kind any human being would make when a child calls out to them. A moment of recognition that lasted maybe half a second, but half a second was enough. William noticed. His step faltered just slightly, his gaze sharpening as it locked onto Rowan. To the crowd, it was invisible. To the guards in line, it was like a crack of thunder. Near the rope barrier, people were still smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. Someone whispered, "How sweet!" Another voice, "Look at those uniforms, like something from a fairy tale." But fairy tales don't usually end with what happened next. Camilla leaned toward her aide, voice pitched low, but not quite low enough. Even after all these years, some of them still forget what their role is. A soldier who lets his mind wander is a liability to everyone around him. The aide gave a quick nod, but his glance toward Rowan carried more hesitation than agreement. You could see the conflict in his face. This was Sergeant Hale they were talking about, not some green recruit fresh from training. The senior officer at William's side cleared his throat softly. "Your Royal Highness, that's Sergeant Hale. 20 years' service. Impeccable record. One of our most decorated—" But William's expression hadn't softened. If anything, it had grown colder. His jaw was set, eyes still locked on the guard, who had dared, for the briefest moment, to remember he was human. The silence stretched. Tourists began to sense something was wrong, their excited chatter fading, until only the winter wind filled the forecourt. A few phones tilted higher, lenses trained on whatever was about to unfold. William's voice finally cut the air like a blade. "Sergeant!" Rowan didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed forward, every muscle locked in ceremonial position. The only acknowledgement came in the barest tightening of his jaw, a soldier's signal of readiness. "You broke bearing!" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried across the stone forecourt with the weight of absolute authority, and everyone within 50 feet knew exactly what they meant. Around Rowan, the line of guards held perfectly steady. Not a blink, not a twitch. But you could feel the tension ripple through them like electricity. The awareness that one of their own had drawn royal displeasure. Rowan's silence was the silence of centuries of guards before him. Complete, disciplined, unbreakable. Camilla's gloved hand brushed William's arm, her voice soft but pointed enough for nearby officers to hear. "Standards must be upheld, William. If one man falters, what message does that send to the others? What does it say about our discipline?" The senior officer took a cautious step forward, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Royal Highness, Sergeant Hale has served with distinction in—" William lifted a hand, cutting him off without taking his eyes from Rowan. The pause before his next words seemed to stretch forever, heavy with the weight of what everyone knew was coming. When he spoke again, his voice carried easily across the entire forecourt. "Sergeant Rowan Hale, you are hereby stripped of your post, relieved of ceremonial duty, effective immediately." The reaction was instant and visceral. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp as breaking glass, followed by the kind of stunned silence that falls when people realize they've just witnessed something irreversible. Even the tourists, who couldn't fully grasp the gravity of military discipline, understood instinctively that something important had just been broken. Phones that had been lowering shot back up. Conversations died mid-sentence. 2 officers stepped forward from the side of the formation. Their movements were hesitant, almost reluctant, like men carrying out an order they didn't believe in. One reached for Rowan's rifle, the polished steel catching a shard of winter sun. Rowan released it without resistance. His hands were steady, betraying no emotion as the weapon he'd carried with pride for over 2 decades was taken from him. The officer who received it looked almost as uncomfortable as the man who'd surrendered it. "Step aside," the other murmured, voice barely audible. Rowan turned once sharply, his boots striking stone with parade ground precision. Then he marched to the edge of the forecourt, with the same measured steps that had carried him through combat zones and state ceremonies alike. The line of guards never flinched. Their training held them motionless, but behind every fixed gaze was the unspoken weight of what they'd just witnessed. One of their most respected NCOs, stripped of his post, not for cowardice or corruption, but for acknowledging a child's wave. William stood a moment longer, letting the silence settle like dust after an explosion. Then he continued the inspection as if nothing had happened, his step steady, his expression unchanged. But the ceremony's rhythm was shattered. The music of precision had hit a wrong note, and everyone could hear it. Tourists whispered among themselves. Dignitaries shifted uncomfortably. Even the remaining guards, trained to ignore everything except their duty, felt the tremor of something larger than protocol. At the forecourt's edge, Rowan stopped. Without his rifle, without his place in line, he looked suddenly solitary, but not diminished. His back remained straight, his chin high, his bearing as commanding as it had ever been. A woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes. "That's not right," she whispered to her husband. "All he did was look at a child." Her husband nodded grimly. 20 years of service. And this is how they thank him. The inspection finally ended. William and Camilla departed through the palace archway, their entourage following in practiced formation. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, people lingering as if unsure whether what they'd seen was really over. But the whispers followed them all the way back to the tube stations and tour buses. By evening, the story would be spreading through social media, carried by phones that had captured every moment of a guardsman's public humiliation. And Rowan Hale, walking back toward Wellington Barracks with measured steps, carried more than just the memory of his dismissal. He carried the knowledge that respect, real respect, couldn't be stripped away by royal command. It had to be earned and lost. And sometimes, when the moment was right, reclaimed in ways that authority never anticipated. The march back to Wellington Barracks felt longer than usual. Not because of distance, but because of weight. The kind of burden that settles on a man when he realizes his 20-year career has just ended over half a second of humanity. Behind him, other guards were filing off duty, unbuttoning their tunics, removing their bearskins with the casual relief that comes at the end of ceremonial rotation. But their usual chatter was muted today. Eyes followed Rowan as he walked the corridors toward his quarters. These men knew him. They'd trained under him, served alongside him, looked up to him as the kind of NCO who led by example rather than volume. His empty rifle rack would speak louder than any order posted on the bulletin board. Inside his modest quarters, Rowan sat on the narrow bed, his scarlet tunic folded neatly beside him. His hands rested on his knees, steady as they'd always been, whether holding a rifle on parade or carrying wounded civilians to safety in places whose names never made the evening news. The knock on his door came after maybe 20 minutes. Sergeant Ellis stepped in, closing the door behind him with the careful quiet of a man who knew this conversation mattered. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant?" Ellis asked, though they both knew rank didn't matter right now. "Always have it with me, lad." Ellis was younger, one of the generation who joined after the wars, who knew Helmand only from stories and Sierra Leone only from regimental history, but his words carried the weight of genuine respect. What happened out there? That wasn't discipline, that was spite. Rowan looked up, studying the young man's face. "Careful, Ellis. That kind of talk is what every man in this barracks is thinking right now." Ellis's voice was quiet, but firm. "You've done more for this regiment than most officers manage in their entire careers, and they stripped your post because you acknowledged a child." The silence stretched between them, filled with things neither man could say aloud. Finally, Ellis straightened to attention and offered a crisp salute. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, you still have mine." After Ellis left, others came, not many, and never in groups that would attract attention. Corporal Webb, who'd served under Rowan in training. Private Matthews, who'd been close to washing out until Rowan took personal interest in his development. Senior men whose respect meant more than any ceremonial posting ever could. They didn't come to protest or plan rebellion. They came to show solidarity in the only way military discipline allowed, quietly, personally, with the kind of loyalty that can't be ordered or stripped away. In the mess that evening, the atmosphere was subdued. Men sat in their usual places, but conversations carried a different weight. When Rowan entered to collect his meal, the room didn't fall silent. That would have been too obvious, but voices dropped just enough to show awareness. At one table, Corporal Webb leaned toward his mate. "They can take his post," he said quietly, "but they can't take what he's carried. Can't take what he's done for the men here." Rowan heard it, but didn't acknowledge it, focusing instead on his tray. But the words settled into him like warmth, a reminder that some things matter more than ceremony. Later, sitting by the window overlooking Birdcage Walk, he watched London's lights flicker in the distance. The barracks carried its eternal rhythm around him, boots being polished for tomorrow, Rifles cleaned and stacked, uniforms pressed with military precision. Tradition endured. It always had. But within those walls, every man now knew a truth that no amount of protocol could erase. A soldier's value wasn't measured in his ability to stand motionless, but in what he'd done when movement mattered most. The summons came the next morning, delivered on official letterhead that might as well have been a court order. Sergeant Rowan Hale is to report to the review board, Wellington Barracks, 0900 hours. He read it once, folded it neatly, and slid it into his tunic pocket. Some things were inevitable. The army didn't let breaches, real or imagined, slip quietly into the background, especially when they happened in front of the future king. The review chamber was exactly what you'd expect. Functional to the point of being sterile. A long table, 3 senior officers in dress uniform, and a single chair positioned like an island in the middle of all that authority. The only decoration was the regimental crest on the far wall, its gilt edge dimmed by years of cigarette smoke and furniture polish. Rowan entered at precisely 9 a.m., his boots striking the floor in deliberate cadence. He stopped in front of the chair and came to attention, waiting for permission to sit like a good soldier. Colonel Ridley, the board's chairman, gestured toward the seat. Sergeant Hale. He sat, not stiff, but alert, the posture of a man who'd faced hostile questions before and knew how to weather them. Ridley opened a leather folder, his movements deliberate. You're here to answer for yesterday's breach of bearing during royal inspection. His Royal Highness witnessed the infraction personally. Rowan inclined his head slightly, neither confirmation nor denial, just acknowledgement. Major Keating, the second officer, adjusted his spectacles with the fussy precision of a man more comfortable with paperwork than people. You look toward the crowd when your focus should have been forward. Do you dispute this? I do not. And do you acknowledge that such a lapse compromises the dignity of the entire guard? Here it was, the moment where most soldiers would bow their heads, accept responsibility, and hope for mercy. But Rowan had spent too many years in places where dignity meant survival to let it slip away quietly. His voice remained calm, respectful, but unmistakably firm. If you believe dignity is measured by a man's refusal to acknowledge a child's greeting, then I suppose it does. The words hung in the room, like smoke from a gun nobody expected to fire. Keating's pen stopped moving. Lieutenant Colonel Harwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even Ridley, who'd probably run dozens of these boards, seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. When the silence stretched too long, Ridley leaned forward, his tone sharpening. Sergeant, this isn't the time for philosophy. You've served long enough to know that ceremony leaves no room for personal interpretation. Your attitude is troubling. Rowan's eyes remained steady, meeting each officer's gaze in turn before he spoke. With respect, sir, my attitude is based on experience. I've carried children out of burning buildings in Sierra Leone. I've held position under mortar fire to protect civilians who couldn't protect themselves. I've buried friends who died following orders without question. His voice never rose, never lost its respectful tone, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Those are the things that taught me what dignity really means. Not the ability to ignore a boy's wave, but the willingness to risk everything for something greater than yourself. Strip that away, and all you have left is pageantry. Harwood cleared his throat. The Prince's decision was public, Sergeant. What's expected now is acceptance. I understand that, sir. And, Ridley pressed. Rowan looked at each man in turn, then spoke with the quiet conviction that had carried him through wars and ceremonies alike. And I won't pretend that 20 years of service can be erased by a moment of human recognition. I won't call compassion a crime, or discipline a substitute for humanity. If that's what's required of me, then I'll keep my silence, but I won't lie about what happened or why it mattered. The words settled into the room's corners like dust that couldn't be swept away. For a long moment, none of the officers spoke. They'd expected contrition, maybe defiance, but not this quiet articulation of principles they'd somehow forgotten they once held themselves. Ridley closed the folder with the heavy finality of a judge passing sentence. You leave us no choice, Sergeant. His Royal Highness has already spoken. The board recommends your removal from all ceremonial duties. Rowan stood, his movements smooth and controlled. He came to attention and delivered a salute so crisp it could have passed inspection anywhere in the Commonwealth. Understood, sir. He turned and walked toward the door, his boots echoing down the corridor with the same steady rhythm they'd carried for 2 decades. Behind him, the officers remained silent, staring at the empty chair and wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that they'd just disciplined a better man than any of them. In the days that followed, something shifted in the atmosphere at Wellington Barracks. Not rebellion, the guard wasn't built that way, but a quiet acknowledgement that spread through conversations in the mess, glances in the corridors, and the way younger soldiers straightened when Rowan passed. His stories began to travel, not the sanitized versions from official records, but the real ones, told in whispers between duties by men who'd served alongside him or trained under his guidance. Corporal Webb shared the story of Sierra Leone, how Rowan had faced down a riot with nothing but his presence, standing between angry civilians and nervous soldiers until tempers cooled and violence was averted. Sergeant Ellis talked about Helmand, where Rowan had held his position through 3 days of mortar attacks, refusing evacuation until every civilian in his sector was evacuated to safety. Senior NCOs, who'd known him longest, spoke of the personal sacrifices, the funerals he'd paid for when the regiment's budget wouldn't cover them, the broken soldiers he'd mentored back to stability, the families he'd supported through deployments and losses. These weren't protests, they were testimonies. And gradually, throughout the barracks, a new understanding took hold. You could strip a man of his ceremonial post, but you couldn't strip away the respect he'd earned through service. Rowan himself never sought the attention. He carried himself through remaining duties with the same quiet dignity he'd always shown, though his rifle rack stayed empty and his name disappeared from ceremonial rosters. But something had changed. In the narrow hallways, men stepped aside with deference rather than routine courtesy. In the mess, a place was kept for him without being asked. On the drill square, even officers watched him with a new kind of careful respect. It wasn't admiration born of rebellion against authority. It was recognition of something deeper, the understanding that some soldiers carry legacies too substantial for any prince's word to diminish. Days later, a palace aide arrived unannounced at Wellington Barracks. His Royal Highness requires your presence. St. James's Palace. Immediate departure. The ride across London was silent, except for the hum of tyres on wet pavement. St. James's Palace carried a different weight than Buckingham. Older stone, narrower corridors, the accumulated gravity of centuries pressing in from every direction. Rowan was escorted through halls that had witnessed dynasties rise and fall, past portraits of monarchs who'd learned the hard way that authority and respect weren't the same thing. The aide stopped at a heavy oak door and knocked once. "Sergeant Hale, your Royal Highness." Prince William stood at tall windows, streaked with February drizzle, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn immediately when Rowan entered. "Leave us," William said quietly. The aide withdrew, the door closing with a soft click. For nearly a minute, only the ticking of an antique clock filled the silence. Then William turned, his expression composed, but carrying tensions that betrayed something unspoken. "Sergeant Hale, your Royal Highness." Rowan bowed his head slightly, standing at attention. William studied him with the same intensity from the inspection, but now there was something else in his gaze. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of second thoughts he wasn't ready to acknowledge. 23 years of service, William began, voice carefully controlled. Exemplary record, multiple deployments, commendations for valour. Yet on the one day I personally conduct inspection, you choose that moment to break discipline. Rowan's voice was steady. "I didn't break discipline, your Royal Highness. I acknowledged a child who called to me for less time than it takes to draw breath. Nothing more." William stepped closer, jaw tightening. That moment was witnessed by hundreds. Discipline in the Guard isn't conditional, it's absolute. "Discipline, yes, but not inhumanity," Rowan replied quietly. "There's a difference between following orders and becoming a statue. We're flesh and blood, sir. And sometimes flesh and blood remembers what it means to be human. You would argue that personal sentiment outweighs duty. I would argue that duty without compassion is empty ceremony. Rowan's words were respectful but unwavering. Your mother understood that. She taught this nation that respect must be earned, not demanded. That hasn't changed because of a crown. For the first time, William's composure cracked, not into anger, but something closer to discomfort. His shoulders tensed, gaze flickering toward rain-streaked windows. "You presume much, Sergeant." "I speak from experience," Rowan continued, steel beneath courtesy. "I've carried wounded men to safety under fire. I've stood between rioters and innocents with nothing but determination. I've buried soldiers who died because they followed orders without question." He paused, letting the weight settle between them. "Those experiences taught me that discipline keeps us standing, but dignity, real dignity, is what makes us worth standing for. Take that away, and all you're left with is an empty show." The silence was profound. William paced to the windows, hands clasped tighter. Rain continued its percussion against glass. London carrying on obliviously beyond the palace walls. "The order stands," William said finally, voice carrying finality. "You are relieved indefinitely." Rowan inclined his head. "Understood, Your Royal Highness." He turned toward the door, then paused without looking back. "Respect isn't silence, sir. It's service. And sometimes the hardest service is reminding those above us what truly commands loyalty." In the weeks that followed, the palace carried on as always. But beneath the surface, conversations grew quieter when Rowan's name was mentioned. Officers who'd once spoken briskly about maintaining standards chose their words more carefully. The easy certainty they'd always felt about protocol had been complicated by the memory of a good soldier humiliated for human decency. At Wellington Barracks, Rowan's absence from ceremonial rosters was felt more keenly than any official order could capture. Younger soldiers especially felt it, men who'd looked up to him as an example of what 20 years of honourable service looked like. Rather than fight the system, Rowan chose a different path. If the palace no longer wanted his experience on the forecourt, he'd invest it where it might actually make a difference, with the young recruits. Every morning at dawn, while the parade square was still wet with dew, Rowan could be found working with the newest soldiers. His voice carried the authority of earned experience, never raised, but somehow carrying further than shouted commands. "Discipline isn't about standing still because someone told you to," he told them, adjusting a young soldier's grip on his rifle. "It's about standing still because others are counting on you to be there. Learn that difference, and you'll understand what this uniform actually represents." The recruits listened with the intensity young soldiers reserve for lessons that might keep them alive someday. Unlike formal training from other instructors, Rowan's lessons came wrapped in stories from places where those lessons had been tested. Word spread quietly through the barracks. Senior NCOs began finding excuses to observe from a distance, watching him transform nervous recruits into confident soldiers through patient guidance and hard-earned wisdom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man the palace had deemed unfit for ceremonial duty was proving more valuable as a teacher than half the instructors with official appointments. 3 months later, on a morning when spring was finally pushing winter out of London's streets, Rowan left Wellington Barracks in civilian clothes for the last time. His bearing remained unchanged, straight back, measured step. The quiet dignity of a man who knew his worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. At the barracks gate, something extraordinary happened. A group of young guards stood waiting, not ordered there by any officer, not following protocol. They'd come on their own, still in scarlet tunics, rifles slung across shoulders. As Rowan approached, one after another raised their hands in crisp salute, not mechanical gestures of parade drill, but the conscious choice of soldiers honouring someone they respected. Rowan didn't return the salutes. That wasn't his role anymore. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more dignity than any ceremonial response could have managed. A car had slowed on Birdcage Walk. From behind tinted windows, Prince William watched the scene unfold with an expression caught between regret and something he couldn't quite name. He said nothing as the car rolled on toward his next appointment, but the image would stay with him. a dismissed soldier walking away, while better men than he had ever been saluted his passing. Rowan never looked back. His step remained even, shoulders straight, carrying him forward with the same quiet strength that had defined his service. The palace might have stripped him of a post, but they'd given him something more valuable, the knowledge that respect, once truly earned, couldn't be taken away by royal decree. Sometimes vindication doesn't come in headlines or official statements. Sometimes it's found in the salutes of young soldiers who understand the difference between authority and leadership, in walking away with honour intact, while those who dismissed you are left to explain their choices to history. He'd proven that some things, dignity, integrity, the courage to remain human in institutions designed to make you less, couldn't be stripped away by anyone's command. And in the end, that was a victory worth more than all the parades in the world. What do you think? Was Prince William right to maintain discipline at any cost, or did he go too far in humiliating a decorated veteran? Should the guards be expected to stand like statues no matter what? Or is there a place for humanity even in the most formal ceremonies? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than the palace would like to admit. If this story reminded you that real strength doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit that like button. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We've got more stories about the incredible men and women who serve with honour, even when honour isn't returned. Share this with someone who needs to remember that respect can't be demanded, only earned, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to bow when bowing means abandoning who you are. There's another story waiting for you right on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away. Thanks for watching. And remember, authority might command obedience, but it takes character to command respect.